Very good. Very good. Very welcome, everybody. Yeah. You can probably hear me without this, but I need it because we're also on the web. And this is a bit of a special seminar. So especially welcome, everybody. There was a bit of a feedback there, but anyway, very welcome, everybody.
Welcome twice.
Yeah, doubly welcome. This is a World Council event, just like there is ERE, so there is ERE, and there is an ERE with 2 E's for Eastern Asia and so on. So in principle, one in every region. And there is a World Council. And also was on that World Council, just stepped off it recently, and also on the European Council. And so they have come up with the suggestion of having a global event. So in principle, there are similar events going on in all the other regions of the world. I don't know if exactly simultaneously, probably not, but anyway, roughly when they have their conference. And all of these available online. We're being recorded and there are people listening online, but it will also be available afterwards. And so in principle, you can go in and sort of see the different flavors that we would have in different regions of the world. And it's a bit of an experiment to see. The World Council has these every 4 years, there's a World Conference. And this is an experiment to see if perhaps the World Council can have events in between, perhaps at every year or something. We have 4, 5 great speakers here. Don't take it away, please. There we are. Thanks. So they're sitting here, and in the next slide, there's a little bit of presentation. We'll start with Anna Kriti, who is professor at Dauphine and the director of their chair on climate economics. And she's also at Berkeley, and she's in many of these participants have multiple roles. So I'll skip fairly quickly over them, but she works extensively on regulation and competition, network externalities and utilities, energy and climate. We have Aldo in the middle there, who has worked tirelessly both in the Italian ministry and in the DG Sustainable Development, where he's the chief economist. And he also presided a number of OECD committees on tax and environment, and is president of the Green Budget Europe. Really one of the figures who tries to bridge into policy, deeply into real policy making, which is sort of the topic of today. Then we have Ottmar Edelhofer, director of PEAK, the Potsdam Institute for Klimaforschung, and the MCC, Mercator Research Institute. He's a professor at the Technische Universität in Berlin, and he was the co-chair of the IPCC AR5, Working Group 3, put in a tremendous, heroic, Herculean kind of effort in making that a great book of 1,500 pages. And since then, also very active in the German and European national academies, and a co-chair of a platform of the European Council of Academies. We have Matti Liski, far end. I noted he is professor at Aalto, but he's also at MIT, in Cambridge, at CESIFO, and in Toulouse. So basically all the good universities have asked Matti to help come and work. And so he's does research on theoretical and empirical microeconomics with application to industrial organization, all the kind of subjects that underlie public policy making. And we have Åsa Löfgren, who, together with me, but she's done most of the work, has organized this panel. And she is, like me, from Gothenburg. She's also a university fellow at Resources for the Future and a visiting professor in Luleå, and has been on the Swedish Climate Council, for instance. So to varying extents, everybody here bridges either with more emphasis on theory or more on policy, but still everybody is interested in the bridge between theory and policy. Now this is not working. Can press the advance the slides maybe. Oh, okay, I'll be further away from this. Yeah, there we are. That's it. That does it. So we have a couple of questions, which I'll summarize by saying, really, how should we think about policy making in the light of the difficulties we're facing with the global uncertainties about politics, about energy markets, and the pathway to transition that we need out of the fossil era? We need to identify what are the key uncertainties that policy makers must face, and what policy responses should be considered. And eventually we'll have like 2 rounds. So we'll start with those 3 questions, and then we'll eventually in the second round we'll come to the 4th question about how to deal with policy acceptability. How should marginalized populations be sheltered from some of the costs, and other issues of acceptability. So there'll be 1 round of like 4 minutes each for the first couple of questions. And then there would be another round again with looking more at policy responses and particularly policy acceptance. And at the end, an open debate with the audience. And I'll just kick off with some reflections. We have both good and bad news, mostly bad news. When I think about it, when I look back, I've been working on environmental and climate related issues for about 3, not to say 4 decades. And one of the, this, can we slow down again? There we go. Again, twice. Okay. One piece of really fantastic news is renewables. We were talking about this 30 years ago. We were already worried about climate change, and we were worried about nuclear power. And we some of us vaguely said, well, there will be renewables. And the physics showed that, in fact, the flow of energy from the sun would be sufficient. So we were kind of said, well, these things will sort themselves out. There will be renewables. And it's true. We were a little bit optimistic and a little bit naive, but it turned out we were right, more right than we really deserved to be. Renewables are the big success story. They have turned out to work better than we thought and become cheaper and cheaper the more we develop them. That's just about the end of the good news. Everything else that has happened, there's lots of bad news as well. I mean, we're now fighting an energy war in Europe. Gas pipelines are being blown up. Nuclear power plants are seeing active combat inside the nuclear power plants. Dams are being blown up. And energy is being used as a weapon. When the winter is approaching, Russia is threatening, or threatened the last winter to cut off energy supply. So We have a rise of authoritarianism and threats to democracy and rise of populism, polarized political debate, and there are strong connections between fossil wealth and lobbying and the threats to democracy. There are also a large number of other environmental problems, biodiversity, spread of chemicals and things that are actually related to some of the alternatives. Some of the alternatives we could imagine to the fossil era may cause other problems that we need to worry about, that also turn out to be perhaps planetary boundaries, to speak with one of our colleagues. And so there's interaction there. The final piece of bad news is that our favorite, cheapest and most effective policy instrument, the pricing of carbon, or emissions more broadly speaking, is fraught with difficulty and not very popular. And so it has become an easy target for our opponents to attack. All kinds of people who want to promote fossil power, for instance, of some kind, they will say, well, the carbon tax would be bad for the poor. Now, they don't really maybe really care about the poor, but anyway, it's a very effective argument and turns out to be very powerful. So that's a big problem. The panel will discuss solutions, right? But I mean, I have a few ideas, one or two. I think that earmarking of revenues, carbon tax revenues for renewables is a good idea. I think revenue recycling maybe also. I think that building infrastructure in general, transmission and stuff, which we know is actually costly, but it's, on the other hand, is quite popular because it causes employment. And I mean, in a way, this is what the IRA and the Fit for 55 will be doing, some of this. Maybe this will create, we could hope for a transition boom. It's a little bit like the post-war reconstruction or something. So there could be some positive news or some possibilities for policymaking there. And the final thing that is more just open question, I think we need to think carefully about whether we want policies at the EU level or at the national levels. We in Sweden are facing this a severe and tough choice. We are used to being one of the front runners in Europe, we think anyway, we thought. Now we are definitely not. We have a fascist-influenced government, and they are cutting all the environmental policies. And we are now grateful because the European Union has instead increased, for the moment, anyway, its ambitions a lot. And so we are glad to have the European Union policy instead. But this may be similar in some other countries, but it could be dangerous to give up the national ambitions, because then perhaps, we don't know, maybe there would be also an attack on your green policies at the European level in a few years. So with this as a little bit of an introduction, I'll go back to the order of the speakers. Here we can. We can let Anna start, and I'll try to be a timekeeper. So you have about 4 minutes. So shall I? Have you got, so you have another microphone? That's great. And I'll sit down. Åsa will be taking notes and participating both in the panel, but also sort of representing the online audience a little bit with questions. Right, Anna, please.
Now it works. Thank you for the opportunity to share our views on these key issues for today and tomorrow's European energy and carbon markets, but also at the world level. I would be a little bit more optimistic than you, Thomas, if you allow me. Starting from the first questions about the key uncertainties. To me, what we have experienced this year is that we don't know, or we didn't know exactly what an energy price was. I think that one point that this crisis has unveiled is that we live and we consume energy in a way that, people in the household, they didn't realize what it is. They didn't know how important it was in their budget, how it is formed, which are the mechanisms that links the markets, which are set at the European level, up to the final consumer, both at the residential and at the industrial level. So I think that one of the uncertainty is how this is going to move. Considering that we have a crucial interaction between the prices of fossil fuels and also the advantages of renewables. So yes, of course, renewables is a good news, not only in the sense that we have a technology that is, I would say, ready to wear, with costs that are have been declining in the last years, in the last 20 years, even faster than what we thought. That we are attracting investment and they are becoming somehow competitive. But they also have, an impact because they are not per se a technology, they are integrated in the production of electricity. And the key point is whether they are going really to substitute and to displace both in the upstream investment in fossil fuels and then downstream in the production of electricity, and how electricity produced by renewables is going to displace in turn fossil fuels. And then we have renewables, we think wind and solar, but this list is not exhaustive. We have many renewable technologies. So let's think, for instance, to biomethane that also provides some interesting solutions, especially because they can use also the same infrastructure that otherwise would be stranded assets. So I think that the question is which share this new way of producing carbon-free energy will take globally. How fast we go in this idea of substitution and not piling up different technologies and different ways also to bring reliable, secure, carbon-free energy to consumers, and how the counting of the CO2 emissions and therefore the CO2 budget will give us this time to make such an investment. So to me, these are the globally the uncertainty that we face, and on one side they are uncertainty, on the other side, coming back to your last point, these also represent some solutions. And the entrenching of the solution comes with the idea who is going to decide and when. And this is also a point of uncertainty, as you said. There is the European Union globally and what the European Union represents in the global arena, whether it has strength that is credible in order also to counteract other forces that can be political or also technological, and some solution that comes from elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. So Thomas asked us to end, at least in this panel, very pessimistically, because economics is a dismal science, and I think we have some reputation on this. But before we end with pessimism, let me start at least at the beginning to say a few more optimistic words about this. I think despite of all the political, social, economic, and even climate stability, over the last 10 years, we have achieved a lot. And let me summarize this a little bit. First, I agree, renewables are a good story. I would like to share with you one anecdote. So when I was co-chair of the IPCC, I had to produce a report on renewables. And we evaluate all the scenarios about the diffusion of the renewables. Middle of the road scenarios, conservative one, and even a very, very aggressive one or progressive one, which was basically facilitated by Greenpeace, but it was published in a peer-reviewed journal. And then we decided that we should at least report this very progressive scenario. And when we did this, this leads to a huge outrage. So our report has been deserved a lot of comments, in particular in The Economist, where they say the IPCC is now no longer a neutral and a science-based report, because it is absolutely unacceptable that such a scenario will be published. And even when Greenpeace is behind, so this is not acceptable. So if you look now back on all the scenarios, it turns out that even the Greenpeace scenario was very conservative. So the historic development was much faster, much more aggressive, much more progressive. And the Greenpeace scenario looks really very, very awkward and modest. So this is something which is a nice experience to say, and was in 2010. I think, of course, this is a success story, but there are more success stories. I would like to emphasize here the European Green Deal is a big success story. So we have now in Europe, as a cornerstone, the European Emission Trading Scheme 1, which consists of industry and the power sector. So we basically approached almost the 100 euros per ton CO2. It's in that order of magnitude. So the linear reduction factor has been increased. We will see, because of this ETS, a coal phase out in Europe, not just in Germany, in Europe, in the 2030s. I think this is a big success. And despite of all the lobby groups asking the Commission to intervene into the market and to lower the price, so far the Commission did not intervene into the market. I would say that's a big success story. Secondly, we have now in the European level a second ETS, which is called an ETS for transport and building. In fact, it is not an ETS for transport and building. It is fundamentally an upstream system for oil and gas. Europe will reduce the oil and gas imports even before 2040. So this is also, from my point of view, a huge success story. And Europe has set up a social compensation fund to compensate the poor households. We will discuss all these things in a minute. So there are many flaws in this. But in the middle of the Ukrainian war, the European Union was in a position to strengthen the European Green Deal. And this is a huge, huge success from my point of view. And I would like to emphasize, this was also a success story for our profession. Why? Because we said, of course, you need many policy instruments, but carbon pricing is indispensable. Secondly, if you do carbon pricing and want to implement carbon pricing, then what you have to do is you need some kind of social compensation. This is something which has been acknowledged and recognized by the Commission, and they basically build such a structure. And also, of course, it is at least generally agreed that it's a necessity to support innovation. What kind of innovation? Now, currently, the European Union is the first legal and political entity which now starts to talk about carbon dioxide removal technologies. And not just to talk about this and just to think how to finance pilot projects, but also to do some reasonable regulation, which will have a strong impact on the voluntary carbon markets. I think this is a huge, huge success story. And it's a success story also for our profession. One thing I would like to highlight here is, because many people always think that when economists make proposals, So they come up with a first best proposal, and then they end up in a, let's say, in a fifth best implementation. But here I would like to report a huge success story, I apologize that I refer to my own country because I like to criticize my country, but in this specific case, I would like to say something positive. So in the middle of the Ukrainian crisis last year, there was the decision to set up the double whammy, and not all European countries were happy about this. But within this double whammy, in fact, there was a strong implementation to pass the price signal to the consumers and to compensate them via lump sum transfer. And this was quite remarkable. It was technically incredibly complicated, but a bunch of clever economists managed this, that in the end, we end up with almost very close to a first best solution, that basically you have the price signal and you have a lump sum transfer. So that's success stories number one. The second one is, it's the Inflation Reduction Act. We should not forget this. In the middle of the Ukraine crisis, in the middle of all these instabilities, the Inflation Reduction Act is very important because it clearly signals Europe is no longer alone. And again, we will have an opportunity to discuss all the flaws, but politically, I would evaluate the Inflation Reduction Act as a political masterpiece. A political masterpiece. Why? Because it is all about sequencing. They start subsidizing the new technologies. They did this in a way that it is very unlikely that when the Republicans will revert the Inflation Reduction Act, because it is organized very cleverly. And I would say, this is a strong prediction, but I believe that in the next 5 years in the United States, we will have again a debate how to complement or how to introduce in the Inflation Reduction Act some component of carbon pricing. So in that sense, I'm absolutely ready from now on to discuss all these negative things, all the instability, and I'm prepared to end up with a very pessimistic note, which basically confirms and establishes our reputation as the dismal science again. But before I do this, I thought it might be worthwhile to think about these developments, and not just about the political developments, but also the contribution we as a profession made.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We got an extra 2 minutes there for the optimism.
Thank you. I was supposed to be the optimistic guy. Now you took my role. But I try to start with something more sort of pessimistic. When I was in the airplane and thinking about these questions, I started writing my notes, and after 4 pages, I ended writing. But let me try to make the long story short. If you think about the big uncertainties, climate change is one. Climate change is going to change the comparative advantage in the world. It will lead to immigration, migration, and so forth. This is one of the big uncertainties that the government wants to solve. And the other one is geopolitical uncertainty that we experienced through the war and also the corona crisis. This will lead to home sourcing of activities related to supply chains, and also to security of supply concerns are rising in the energy sector. And the third uncertainty, sort of global uncertainty, I would bring here relates to technology and global labor markets. We see that technologies have been particularly rapidly sort of improving. AI technologies this spring, and not only now, but also before, these technologies are shaping the world labor markets, leading to increasing inequality. And this is another thing that governments want to fight: inequality. So if you think about these things, climate change, security of supply, if it relates to production overall, and supply chains or energy, and inequality, and you can put inflation there as well. These are all topics that are kind of very popular in the sense that the government can find support when it tries to fight these problems. And I think I'm quite positive about this government's possibility to fight these problems, because government is in a very unique position in many ways. If you think about the current world where you have no shortage of funds and savings, government is in a position to guarantee loans and investments. It's an amazing number that in Germany, for example, is loans are being private loans are currently guaranteed by government. In Italy, some people say that more than 100% are guaranteed by government. So the government is really in a position to determine what kind of investments are carried out. And some people take this very far, like Frank Napier is a sort of historian, an economist who have said that government is in the future in a position to create money, to determine the broad money base, because central banks are kind of losing power in this sense. But government is kind of handpicking what kind of projects will be taken. What is the direction of investments in the future? And I think that given these challenges, there will be an investment boom, which is like an investment boom where government is setting the rules of the game. And I think this is good news for in many ways. So in the medium term, that was in the questions, that what happens in the medium term, because of this investment boom related to green transition as well, there will be good growth, economic growth. And if you think about what are the big risks here, the big risks are that the government is not always good in allocating capital. So there could be a big misallocation of capital. Think about, for example, this hype about hydrogen economy. And so who knows? This could be a big misinvestment. And there are many other margins where the government can make mistakes. So here, the economist's role, if you think about what is our role in this near-term policymaking, is to really max out the potential of the market when the government is yet setting the objectives for the market. If you think about energy markets, for example, we have aspirations regarding this capacity portfolios. What kind of capacity you want to have in different countries? Different countries have different aspirations. Somehow you need to communicate that to the market in a way that the market can yet deliver these objectives in a most efficient way. How much time do I have? Can I just keep on talking, or I think I went over? Yes. So we have a role, I think, here, but my basic view is that there is reason to be optimistic how this is going to play out.
Sure, with pleasure. It's interesting to see how things change. The previous Italian government shifted the energy responsibility from the Ministry of Industry to the Ministry of Environment and renamed it the Ministry Ecological Transition. This was under the Draghi government. The new government, the right government, has maintained energy with environment and has rebaptized the Ministry of Environment and Energy Security, where we can feel the results of the three crises. My first consideration is that we've been through and we're still inside the three crises of COVID-19 and the new forms it might take, the aggression of Russia to Ukraine, and the following increase in prices of energies, which has been a major problem for each of our governments and countries around Europe and beyond. And the answer to this has been an increase of subsidies, of direct explicit subsidies, of rebates in energy prices and so on, which is understandable in an emergency situation as long as these subsidies or just for the emergency situations, because we have already a very large number of subsidies in our economies, fossil fuel subsidies of which we talk when we talk about climate policy, but also biodiversity harmful subsidies, which have been relaunched by the last COP of the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity, and in general, environmentally harmful subsidies. Some of our European countries are preparing knowledge inventories, catalogs of subsidies. We do it in Italy, the French started, the Germans are doing it, the Swiss have recently come, Finnish and I think Swedish as well. So we need, I think, from the community of experts to produce these elements of knowledge so that we know what is happening in our economies. And I think subsidies is an interesting approach to energy and environmental policy, because there is an element of unfairness, of privilege, which is understandable by public opinion and by all the experts. I think the price signal should remain at the center of our solutions. Certainly we need regulations, certainly voluntary instruments are welcome when they function, but they don't function like in the Netherlands or the USA in other countries like mine very often. So the price signal anyway, we are economists, remains a reference, and we should continue to use it, possibly in a frame of environmental, ecological, fiscal reform, where we propose to have a strong carbon price, to have environmentally strong price signals, and at the same time, we offer compensations in order to protect the poor, the vulnerable citizens and sector in difficulty. But I must say, probably a minority position here. I think the price signal should be kept also for the vulnerable, who must be aware that energy is scarce and needs high, strong prices, increasing through time. We have a lot of instruments with which we want and we can help the poor and the vulnerable, but it's not underpricing carbon, underpricing the environment that we will reach this result.
Thank you.
Okay, so I figured I can bridge to the more pessimistic side, I guess. So I agree with what has been said, but I still want to raise sort of what I think, or I'm most worried about currently, is the political consequences of the sort of financial stress from the crisis that we have seen. I mean, throughout the crisis, the climate ambition of the European Union has been surprisingly resilient. But what I see now is that during spring 2024, there will be new negotiations around a climate target in 2040. There will also be emission reduction targets set for the whole period 2030 to 2050. So basically, there will be a new discussion while we just successfully came through with the Fit for 55 package and sort of managed this throughout the crisis. And given that I speak also, as Thomas said, from a Swedish perspective, we always had the lead, or we would like to think that we had a lead in this issue. But also in Sweden, there has been political discussions about sort of national climate targets, etc. And we'll come back to this. But I think there is a lot of tiredness around discussing those issues in the Commission. And if the Commission is the leader and member states are the laggards, then it may not be a sustainable situation. So there are considerable risks, I would say, for setbacks where sort of short-term political interests will trump climate security. So, but of course, we can do a lot of things. So that was the bridge.
So thank you very much. We actually managed not only to say very sensible points, but also to keep time, so we can have a second round. And then we'll still have time for discussion with the audience. And so we'll start now a little bit more. I mean, to react to what other speakers have said, and we can perhaps look more at problems with policy and particularly the acceptability issues. So we'll start again with
Yes, I think that without giving labels of whether we are optimistic or pessimistic, our diagnosis is quite similar. There are good and bads. And regarding the key uncertainty on the policy responses, I think that the way in which different countries have put in place some policies, whether they are under an emergency situation. So just to also to say that one of the points of the ongoing reform of the electricity markets is even to define what an emergency situation is. We don't know exactly. But the point is that how we foresee that these measures are going to last. And I think that this was an incredible input for the policymakers and also for in our professionals and economists, because between all the uncertainty, there is one certainty that has also been underlined before, that is that the energy prices are going to rise for the scarcity, for the carbon pricing, and also to reflect the way in which markets are organized in Europe. These latter are going to remain a key point of the, not even the policy, but really the philosophy of Europe, the way in which we exchange energy, we exchange CO2 permits in the EU ETS 1 and the EU ETS 2. So we have to be ready to understand. We don't know exactly how the level of these prices, their volatility, their sensitivity to future political shocks, but for sure they are going to rise. And we have to set up now resilient policies and coherent policies. And my point will be that one, coherent policies. We have 27 countries, and we all came from countries where the reaction has been, let's say, adequate. Yes, we can say that Germany is, yeah, you can criticize it, but it's a rich country, right? Between the subsidies that have been given all around Europe, more or less 1/4 comes from Germany. France is more or less the same. Maybe Italy has an upsurge. But there are countries still that are even more at the frontier with where the conflict comes, that they don't have the same possibility, they don't have the same economy. Their level of energy poverty is not exactly the same as we face in those countries, and therefore the vulnerability of those countries is different. So we have to take into account that something that we need is smart subsidies, smart response, in the sense that they can adapt to different questions, to problems of energy efficiency in the buildings. Yes, we do have a policy that is now is going to somehow tax the way in which we do the heating with the EU ETS 2, but there are people that, I mean, they cannot live differently than using fuels, fossil fuels. And at the same time, these people are far from the place where they live. So we need also a transportation policy. Coming back to your idea, we need to build public infrastructure. So the states, it is not only guaranteeing green credits, but they also have to use public money to shed consumers from the high energy prices. So I don't know how we are with the timing, but I've already online several ways.
Yeah, I would like to make two comments and a question to in particular to Matti. First, if you compare the numbers, the volume of subsidies spent in Europe is almost the same as the subsidies spent in the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the same order of magnitude. The question is it really efficient how we spend the subsidies and the money? And here I would like to highlight one important aspect, which is widely underestimated, at least in Europe. So in 2039, fundamentally, we will sell the last permit at the European Emissions Trading Scheme. But still, we will have in the emission trading scheme emissions from the hard to abate sectors. There will be residual emissions. And then the question is, how should we deal with that? So how do we compensate these emissions? And this is something which has to be clarified now. Most policymakers think, oh yeah, CDR, this is something which is important, but it is not important now. It is important in the second half of the century. This is not true. So we are already living in the shadow of this end game, which we anticipate at the end of the 2030s. And investors already anticipate what will happen with the residual emissions. When the Commission is not in a position to create a credible framework, there's a risk that in the end, the emission trading scheme will break down. And this is nothing which has to be resolved tomorrow. We have to start to solve this issue today. I'm not saying we should basically have then the carbon dioxide removals ready today, but we have to prepare this. Now, the carbon dioxide removal is an interesting animal because in carbon dioxide removals, you basically remove CO2 from the atmosphere technologically, or you can do it land-based. But whatever you do is CDR needs a carbon price, but it needs a negative carbon price, a subsidy. Somebody has to pay for that. So we price emissions when somebody is doing harm, but we have to pay people who provide us with some sort of things, natural things or technological things. So we did a calculation. So what's the order of magnitude at the European level? It's between 1.5 to 1% of the European GDP. Globally, it could add up to 3% of the global GDP. So basically, we create then an additional economic sector, a kind of a waste sector for a planetary waste management, which then basically it is hard to find a business model without of the subsidies. So the question is then, do we have sufficient money? Is there sufficient resources in the fiscal space to do this? And this should be prepared. And this brings me to my question to Matti. I'm not sure if I understood you right, but did you say basically the fiscal space is so large, but we shouldn't, despite of increasing interest rate, we shouldn't be concerned because governments have an unlimited possibility to raise money for investments? I was not sure if I understood you right, but if it would be great if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Thank you. Thank you for the question first. If I start with that, I was building on this assumption that there's basically unlimited liquidity and savings in the world at the moment. And these savings are, savings for the retirement and the institutional investors who are looking for places to park their money. And then government can provide relatively secure places, even with relatively low returns, because government is guaranteeing these loans. And some people argue that this is getting big already now, this part of the kind of money creation. And when government has this leverage, it has the leverage to determine the direction of investments. But of course, government is important rule setter in many other ways, like regulations and market designs you've been discussing and so forth. But this is what I had in mind. Not so much that the government would be spending own money, but sort of guaranteeing and taking that liability with the investments. And of course, then you can put in policies in place that support that the liabilities are not bad. If we go back to this sort of how to deal with inequality, let me share some experiences from last winter from the north, where we have very good register data. So we know at the individual level that, information about the household, how much you're earning, and also how much electricity you're consuming. Sort of basic individual level register data is something that we used last winter to find out that who have these big electricity bills and where are the families that would need this support. And then in the end, with Ivo, who was in the room here, we could, using this data that is very sort of was like updated like on a weekly basis, we could tell to the government that if you spend the money this way, then it goes to the right target. And it's the money, it's only fraction of the money that you have to spend when you compensate everybody equally, giving a flat rebate to everyone. But this was completely impossible to implement, even though we had a very leftist government last, if you heard about Sanna Marin and her friends. So it's, they were very leftist, but even for them, it was impossible to implement these targeted transfers. So, but instead they went to this flat transfer where also the wealthy people got the electricity bills compensated. So this is subsidizing households this way. This is where economists can really have an impact if we can convince people that, public money is costly and you need to spend it in a sort of best possible way to minimize the burden of the households and the increase the acceptability of the policies. And this is something that we should more and more do, that we use the sort of high quality data to show what is the efficient way of solving these efficiency equity trade-offs. Good, thank you.
Very much. May I jump in the order and ask a question for because I've heard this, you said this twice now. 39, the granting of permits to the DS was stopped, and the sort of, and therefore the emissions have to stop. But don't we believe in banking? Shouldn't the industries be keeping permits if they want to emit in the 48? Then they would say from 39 to 48.
Yes, exactly. But that's the problem, because if basically so then when they anticipate the residual emissions will be compensated or not, so then this has an impact on the formation of the prices, on the banking behavior, and so on, and this could have a huge destabilization effect. So exactly this is what I'm saying. So they anticipate now. And it's not good to say, let's wait until 2039, or when they will implement the target which we have proposed, so then it's even earlier. So this is not good enough just to wait. It's come up how to compensate that in order to not to distort the price formation in the market. This is exactly what I'm saying. Thanks for clarifying that.
Thomas, you were mentioning the good news coming from renewables, and certainly we have there a patrimony that we can share. I'm thinking to the reports of IRENA, that many people call IRENA, the International Renewable Agency, based in Abu Dhabi, and which is led by Francesco La Camera, an Italian to whom we gave the prize here at the EARE conference, that many call the ERE conference, last year in Rimini as the economist practitioner. And there's a lot of good analysis and prices and technologies and so on. As well as at OECD, we're launching an IFCMA, that they call IFCMA, Inclusive Forum for Carbon Mitigation Approaches, which might give us a lot of knowledge and elements beyond the 38 OECD countries. Things are moving. But renewables, but also when we talk about renewables, we should always quote energy efficiency, because at the end of the day, the best energy is the zero energy, the energy that we don't use, that we save, that we avoid to consume and produce. And thanks to the historical perspective that Otmar was introducing earlier, I think we should think when we had the forecast of energy consumption and production with exponential rhythm of increase. In the 70s, Italy was expected to need 44 nuclear plants like the French program. At the end of the day, thanks to high energy prices, we don't have fossil fuels in our ground, or very little. Thanks to a high taxation of fossil fuels and energy, we've been able to develop a low energy intensive industry, and we've been able to have an excellent energy performance intensity. So the forecast that are planning and dominating most of the traditional economists, telling us that we need an incredible doubling and tripling of energy consumption and production at 20, 30, and 40 years time of horizon, we should be careful with that, because we've seen in the past it was not so. And Otmar, you were mentioning the Green Deal, obviously, and Thomas, you were mentioning the 92 agreement on climate. It's 30 years that some of us are trying to push forward for ambitious climate and energy policies. And probably if we had listened to the Club of Rome in 72, the MIT report on the limits of growth, all this was quite clear. We have a problem of also enlarging these themes, because we have the Green Deal now at European Union level, and it was amazing and pleasantly surprising that von der Leyen, coming from her political, historical, technical capacity, was able to be a leader and a promoter in a very difficult period. But we risk to have a counter reaction by many countries, by many people. And one thing is to talk, all of us, the environmental economists and resource economist community together. When we go out to the traditional economists, we are already in trouble. And when we go beyond to public opinion, to political parties who have not paid attention to these things in history, we are in trouble. So we must be prepared. sometimes we have good news. So we must be ready, I think, when the train passes by to take it and go along, wherever it is, at any level, European, national, local, or global altogether.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to raise a few points in relation to policy and also acceptance that may, the first two go a little bit beyond maybe what we usually think of as economists, that for a more accelerated deployment of renewables, there are also other barriers such as permitting processes or procurement processes that are actually quite significant, that need to be dealt with and considered also by us, I think. We also need to have more elaborate policies that can handle those more short-term to medium energy supply at the same time as not compromising climate ambition, which means that some capacity maybe need to shut down early. So a truncated lifespan maybe for relatively clean natural gas to be able to trade off climate and the need for securing energy supply in the short run. As many have already alluded to, policies needs to be fair and equitable. We will discuss that more. And in this perspective, I think, again, I'm going to raise the issue, maybe because this is currently debated in Sweden about national climate targets, and are those necessary given the sort of climate goals on the EU level? And I would say that there are arguments for that that may go sort of beyond what we normally think as economists. One is that a target in a national setting is more salient or more sort of the democratic process for citizens in countries is closer at home to have a national target that could actually legitimize an EU target. So I still think there are good reasons for having national climate targets because of democratic reasons. It's also sort of in this uncertain world, investors, there is so much information, and a climate target, even at sector level that might seem inefficient at first, is a really good sort of coordination or commitment from a government that investors could actually look at, and that would reduce their uncertainties. Also, climate targets at the national level signal something to other member states. So moving forward with the negotiations and the reform discussions that will come, those targets actually provide information. So I would actually argue that those are really important even moving forward.
Thank you. So I'd like to open up now. Are there questions or comments from the audience? Yes, good. Let me say your name, but the people on the Eastern Europe. While you are thinking, you others prepare for if you have more questions. There's one more question.
No. Thank you. So it's a somewhat different question, but it builds on what also mentioned. I wonder whether we are talking about uncertainties here. And I think that a major uncertainty could be labor shortages. One major uncertainty is what Åsa mentioned about the permitting procedures and so on, because to integrate these renewables, we need modern grids and expanded grids, and most European member states are probably having issues to meet their renewables targets already for 2030 with the current grids and with the current possibilities to expand their grids.
But there is also an issue of permitting procedures, administrative capacity, but also labor shortages in other issues such as building renovations or heat pump installations. There are so many business associations in Germany, France, the UK that report dozens of thousands of labor shortages in these topics. And we know that Eastern Europe has demographic challenges. So who is going to install all these? And we need to accelerate action, but is it possible? And would that uncertainty risk undermining also the EU climate targets?
Okay, good. Now, the challenge for climate policy, or the challenge for Eastern European on climate policy, here I would like to say two things. The first one is in the ETS1, with this high price, this will be a challenge for, in particular for Poland, also because at this price, there is now a challenge for the coal phase out. And I would say, before the Ukrainian war, this would be extremely difficult to discuss that with them. But because of the war in the Ukraine, energy security becomes now more important. And I think it would be worthwhile to explore with them a little bit in depth. So what would be the advantages for energy security? Because for them, this is mainly an energy security issue and not so much a climate policy issue. But if we could combine both aspects and convince them they should not lobby too much in the European Commission to intervene into the price building. So I think that could be a reasonable way forward. This issue of labor shortage, I think this is extremely important. For my taste, we have too much debate, at least in Europe, about green industrial policy, because this is a policy which basically we can do this a bit. So when we think about hydrogen or the steel industry, but I think these are very, very special things. We should think in a broader sense. So how to manage the structural change in our economies. And if we think about the structural change, so the labor market definitely is key, because I think the climate policy puts an enormous pressure on the matching function of the labor market. And I share the same concern with you. And by the way, also, so how can we really reallocate capital? There might be a lot of capital around, but is the financial market really in a position to provide the money and the capital allocation in an appropriate way? I have my doubts here. If I look, for example, beyond Europe, so the capital costs for renewables, for example, the capital costs for renewables are not declining, but increasing. So in that sense, I have not a good answer to that, but I think we should open the box a little bit and not just talk about green industrial policy, but embed this in a broader structural change and focus much more on the labor market. So there is, from the Climate Council in the UK, a very interesting study. It's a first step, how to link, or they linked here the labor market requirements to the carbon neutrality issue. And I think this is just the first step, but I would say we should explore this a little bit more in detail.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here.
Yes, yes, I'm Maria Eugenia Sanin from University Paris-Saclay in Paris, and related also to this answer, a question that we usually have in terms of vulnerability that we were talking about before, and also in terms of labor markets, we have this disconnect somehow between the European policies regarding carbon pricing and the fact that protecting the vulnerable is a national issue because it's fiscal policy, right? And so I was wondering if you have any ideas, or at least you have seen some research discussing these disconnects between the ability of helping vulnerable populations among countries, which they are also very different, and it's under the umbrella of fiscal policy, and the European agenda in terms of greening and carbon pricing.
Thank you. Aldo, you want to?
Indirectly reacting to your question, I think we have a nice tendency to participation in the environmental community. We want everybody to participate in decision-making, in the EIA, SCA processes, and this is something very nice. And we are very sensitive to the social issue, the compensation issues, and so on. Which is correct and fair, and we must continue on that. But we should ask to the other communities, non-environmental economics, to have the same approach in their policies. I mean, we are interested in energy poverty, certainly, but we're also interested in food poverty, in housing poverty. We are interested probably in general poverty. So I'm afraid that many people who are skeptical about climate policy, environmental policy, sustainable development, are hiding behind these issues to put in trouble climate policy and European policies, because I don't see the same attention to social problems in other transport traditional policies, in other agriculture traditional policy, in industrial traditional policies. So very well to pay attention to these things, but the others should be asked to do the same.
Yeah, first of all, I agree, but I think this is a little bit more a more fundamental thing here. I believe that when we, along this transformation process towards carbon neutrality, we will not talk only about carbon pricing. We will talk about congestion charges. We will talk about a whole fleet of Pigouvian prices, so to say. So if citizens perceive Pigouvian pricing as a way that governments want to generate additional revenues for their general budget, I have doubts that this will be accepted. Therefore, it seems to me it would be worthwhile to think in the following way. We say we should not use Pigouvian prices or Pigouvian taxes in general for generating revenues for governments. In one way or another, we should generally say we will recycle this. And we could say some parts could be recycled for green technologies, but some of them should be recycled directly to the households, because otherwise households will not accept that price should be basically what you said, is even the poor households have to pay a high price. But now it comes to a very interesting thing. There are only a few countries in the European Union which are able to channel this kind of revenues directly to the households. Austria is one example. Germany has a huge problem, and it's not just a technical problem, because in Germany we hate computers, right? So we think this is this prevents us from increasing labor productivity. We deeply believe in paper and such kind of things, but we really hate digitalization. So in that sense, of course, so that's a problem. But this is deeper, because many politicians, at least in Germany, perceive direct transfers to the household as something, as a starting point for a universal basic income, right? In the German welfare state, a government cannot provide unconditionally money to citizens. So this is simply impossible. This is not ingrained in the Bismarckian welfare state. The Bismarckian welfare state, you have to tell the government that you are poor, you are disabled, you deserve something. But if you just recycle these things back to the citizens, this is at least, this is a kind of a relatively new way of thinking, at least for us in Germany, like computers. So we don't believe in that so much. But I think, and even it's also quite interesting, in our constitution, we have a few taxes, and our constitution forbids the government to invent new taxes. You have to change the constitution if you want to introduce a new tax. And Pigouvian taxes are explicit, are not not included in the constitution. And therefore, I would say there are two steps. First of all, we should work that this kind of Pigouvian taxes and prices are much more accepted. And we should basically provide analysis that in general, this revenues should be cycled back to the citizens in one way or another, and to establish channels where this could be done effectively. I think that's a huge challenge, but it's necessary because I believe Pigouvian taxation has the best days ahead. So it's another thing of the past.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have several. I just wanted to say one word on recycling and since I am holding the microphone. I really strongly believe, I mean, economists, we know that it's not optimal to recycle everything, but it's in this case, the needs, the financial needs of the transition, just building transmission lines alone is such a gigantic task, and there is so much infrastructure. We will be needing much more money than the Pigouvian taxes raise. So it's cheap. We can promise we will recycle everything because we are going to have to spend a shitload of money on new infrastructure. But now there was Anna, and then Matti, and then also someone from the, so we'll go in that order. Come on.
Yes, I think that when we talk about taxation, everyone wants to give a word, right? Because I mean, this is our business. I don't know whether in France we like computers or not, but I mean, there was many essays of introducing taxation. And I remember one that was the social VAT that has been raised in a period of crisis in order for the government to get extra money and to make a redistribution. So the idea is that, as you said, we are now commenting by saying, well, this is good, this is bad, but basically we have to start again. So we're thinking about new ways of intervention, new form of taxation that maybe have to be decided at the European level in order to, as an exception. We made a lot of exceptions during the crisis now, so maybe we have learned how to do exceptions. Not to mention that this kind of exception, and I think vital for the way in which we conceive the harmonization of the European economies, because if you look at the way in which we tax fuels all across the countries, there is really a disorder. Everyone has his own tax rate. There is not even the start of an harmonization. So I think that this will be a very important point to make an assessment of how we tax fuels and who is going to, I mean, to give also some lessons learned from fuel taxation, and starting from there, trying to build some common policy on fuel taxation at the European level. And I think that we are on the point of conceiving the new rules. And just to make another example, so actually in the context of the so-called European reform of the electricity markets, there is one specific issue that is being debated with no consensus. And this issue is basically on the side of France, that is proposing this idea of contract for differences, public contract for differences, where the money will be used by the government because he's the only one that is able to protect consumers. So the idea is that the benefits that will be raised from the renewables, these kind of specific contracts that are insurance from the public side, they are going also to be, let's say, reliable, because the money raised will be passed on to consumers, whereas in the likely private sides of the contract or PPAs, this perhaps won't be the case. So we have to take opportunity like this one to discuss at the European level what we want to do with the old and also the new instrument that we can suggest as from now.
Thank you. This question about fiscal side of the carbon or Pigouvian taxes getting really stimulating people. And I kind of understand this rebating back the, sector by sector, the Pikuvian taxes that you raise, but it's a slippery slope. And but there is certainly support for that from the research that it tends to improve the acceptability when you can target back the revenues to those who are paying the taxes. But there's also this other extreme where you really would think about the whole transfer system that you have for income redistribution, and income taxation is really the pillar of that. So in the end, if you think from the first principles, you should make the Pikuvian taxation as part of the income taxation. In the end of the year when you're reporting end of the tax year when you're reporting your incomes, you could also report if you have electric vehicle, heat pump, all the sort of things that correlate with your carbon footprint. And it could be tailored into your part of your income taxation, and then low-income people would basically perhaps pay no Pikuvian tax, if that's the reasonable. Depends on the kind of activity we're talking about. But this is supported some of the work that we've done on the vehicle owners, and we realized that if you put the same flat CO2 tax on everyone, it really hurts the first two deciles of income earners. And if you take them altogether away, the tax altogether away from these people, it would have basically no impact on the emissions, but you would take away the political cost. But when you put the price such that you see it at the pump, it's very difficult to differentiate among people. But when you put it like part of your income taxation, like that you could deduct in the end of the year your expenses, you could target it to depending on your income and other sort of social circumstances. So I think I would encourage to think the comprehensive reform here.
I don't think that's impossible. In fact, my brother-in-law is a farmer. He pays his carbon tax on his tractor that way. So now it was Osa, I think, and then you had some questions on the. Yeah.
Okay, so there has been some multiple answers to this. So now I'm reading a question before Jan from the audience online. So how would a fair distribution of carbon budget targets among European countries look like? Maybe we can take Jan's at the same time.
Yeah, well, we did write the paper on that with Simon Fines and Ulrike Kornek and others, and all the lowest 2 deciles for the whole of Europe basically consist of the population of Romania and Bulgaria. So it is very much a question of transfer between countries rather than within countries, because the heterogeneity between countries is so large in income. That's a partial answer anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice discussion. And also, if I may say that, like giving a glimpse of optimism, I would like to maybe draw your attention a little bit on the international arena, like maybe what is going on outside of Europe, maybe them also coming back a little bit back on the title of the session, also on the global crisis, etc. So if I listen to you, basically, then basically in Europe, we are kind of more or less facing decarbonization, etc., and are more or less on the right pathway. But I wonder, like, how well are we actually prepared for the geostrategical challenges, given that kind of like the inconvenient truth is that globally the emissions still rise, and they rise because kind of in Indonesia, in China, in India, and other countries, basically, I would say the discussions about climate policy are very less advanced than what we have here in Europe. So it seems to me that your implicit assumption is that, okay, like we might be a role model, and in a couple of years from now, they will follow basically our route, given that renewables and technology is coming down, costs are coming down, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder whether this is really true, like whether they do that fast enough. And I would like to challenge you with a scenario that we might really get kind of more severe impacts very, very soon, climate impacts, and countries such as India might start to release with geoengineering, bringing out sulfur in the atmosphere, etc. Like, how well are we prepared, basically, from a European perspective, to those challenges, particularly given that when we look into the Russian war, I think what is happening there is not only like a horrible war on Ukraine, but also an attempt to really destroy the cohesion of international cooperation and particular kind of destroy kind of the soft power of the European Union in terms of trust with other countries in the global south, bringing a narrative forward like, well, these are the former colonizers and do you really like them and stuff like that. So I wonder, how well are we prepared for that, and how do we kind of account for that also in our considerations of international climate policy?
Who wants the microphone?
I have no answer to this question, but I got the microphone. I have an answer to another question. But before I comment on this, I would like to make a comment to Matti on this income tax, on the first principle. Basically, I agree with you that this would be, if you look at the optimal taxation framework, of course, so then we would have a Pigouvian tax and then we would adjust the income taxes. However, this is only true if we are really mainly concerned about the vertical equity, about differentiation between the different income quintiles. But if you look at the real distributional problems, it's even at the national scale, primarily on a horizontal equity, so the spread within the income quintiles. So, and an income tax reform is not appropriate. You need either a combination of equal per capita distribution and more targeted transfers. So this is something which my feeling is that we have to depart a little bit from the first principle, and there are many people who are not paying income taxes but are really poor. So this is a more complicated thing. So in that sense, I have a slight disagreement. Now to Jan's question, I think now we are leaving now definitely the comfort zone, because I think there are two aspects here. The one is, I agree with you that this whole issue, so you might have in mind this, what will happen or how will Europe respond when India could come up and say, the monsoon has been changed, now we want to experiment with solar radiation management. So this is something we are absolutely not prepared at all to respond to this properly. But we are even not prepared for the next COP28. But and let me elaborate this a little bit. So what is the challenge here? In COP28, it is now led by United Emirates. And the United Emirates, they basically say, what we want to discuss now is, how should we restructure the future oil and gas markets? And they have a proposal for this. They say, we agree with you. We want to phase out fossil fuel emissions, but not fossil fuels. We want to save the problem with carbon capture and storage, plus with CDR. So they could come up and say, we will implement some pilot projects for direct air capture. Let's say in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, they have low electricity prices. They could do this. They could provide also even synthetic fuels. And we are not even prepared to discuss this in a proper way. From my point of view, the next COP28 will be a decisive COP. And I would even predict it will become a historical COP, because it is the first time in a COP that we are really challenged by let's say, by the supply cartel of oil and gas producers. And we have absolutely no reliable response to that. We are not even prepared to think about a thing like a demand cartel on oil and gas markets. We could start to form such a cartel around reducing the methane emissions. we could think about import taxes for oil and gas in order to increase our energy security. All these things are conceptually on the table, but I fully agree we are not prepared at all. And I think the good thing is that in the next COP28, the white elephant in the room can no longer be denied. So it's quite clear. And the Europeans will say, if they will come up with carbon capture and storage and with some kind of CDR, Europe will say, okay, we want to have a global renewable target. I have nothing against the global renewable target, but this is definitely not the right response, right? Because the right response is then how to deal with that and how to restructure the global oil and gas market. And this is a very interesting thing. Sultan Al Jaber is really now in a position to discuss this with the OECD countries, and let's see what will be the outcome. But I'm really scared about the fact that there is no strategic discussion in Europe, and even not in the United States, about these issues.
So just to complement that, yes, we are not ready because we were denying many things in the words of fossil fuel producers, starting from the gas crisis, right? We had directive on gas security supplies that were kept, I don't know, under the pillar of some of the European countries, and then until the crisis has really revealed how unprepared we were. So we had to accelerate in a few months our response. And the same with the strategies of the oil and gas producing countries. We were saying, yes, synthetic fuels, we don't know, they won't take a momentum in the market, or CCS, it exists from, how many years? They say, no, it won't take the market as well. So now we discover in 6 months that these things exist, that they have the patents to do so, and that they want to make it. So it's also the duties of, something that we had neglected, and now we are in the front of them. And I agree with you. Now we have to, play with the cards open. And on the how this will be reflected, and I agree with you that the COP28 will be very important. Coming from the 27th and also the ones on the COP on biodiversity, there are so many issues that have to be discussed. And just wanted to make the point of the event that has taken place last week in Paris, not only because it was the place where the climate economic chair was, and they told us, no, you cannot come because there are all these ministry of whatever it is. So the researchers are not, supposed to stay there together with the policymakers. But also because at the end of the day, this was really under the negotiation. So North and South saying what we do, we need money, we want to restructure the debt, we want to restructure the way in which the low-income countries are going to use these specific rights for having money in a situation of crisis. There was this discussion about taxing the maritime transportation. And at the end of the day, I don't feel that there were a lot of advances. So there was this idea of, yes, roadmaps, intentions. But these are really the true issues that we have to discuss seriously, and not saying, well, we'll listen to you, and then next time start making again taking some decisions. For the taxation of the maritime transport, I think that it is a crucial point, that it is overlooked in the current policies. But just by saying, well, we have a lot of international issues there. There is this, how do we tax something that falls within the international rights? Well, we have some examples where this kind of issues has been resolved politically and also economically in a satisfying way, like the carbon adjustment at the border. So I think that we have the instrument to face some key point opposing the North and the South. But just again, not to deny them as we had done in the previous phase with tensions coming from the oil producing countries.
This exemption of kerosene from international maritime transport and from civil aviation is an old scandal of fossil fuel subsidies, which has not been treated, and vested interest hidden under the ICAO and IMO international agreements. This is a very key issue. I would like also that we do not forget that we have some mistakes in energy and environmental policies, because if some of our countries were highly dependent on Russia as a major supplier of natural gas, there are political and industrial responsibilities behind, and we should try to avoid them. Again, your very shareable comments. At the same time, we shouldn't forget that we have a moral, political responsibility as European Union to go ahead with our policies, because we can show that it is possible to do it, because we need it, because if we don't do it, we don't have the credibility to defend international agreements on climate and sustainable development. And certainly most of our countries have a problem in colonial debt, but it's becoming quite old. And certainly Russia and China cannot teach us very much from their behavior in African countries, South American and Asian countries. So this is also important. But what probably is my major point is that in each of our countries, we have very strong debate, political, economical, theoretical debates. We have people who have understood the climate problems, environmental crisis, sustainable development, and others who have not understood it. And the same is true in all the other countries. China, we always accuse China to be the most emitter in economy in the world, but at the same time in per capita person, they are not. And inside China, in spite of having only one political party, they have an intense debate behind the scenes, and sometimes outside also. So we have to prepare and be near those people. Those who are working for the Green Deal and sustainable development generally are those who are trying to help the developing countries to avoid our mistakes.
Thank you. So,
Just briefly adding on sort of the protectionist aspects of both state aid rules in the EU, the CBAM, and also the Made in America stipulations in the IRA. So again, just, you know, where a price can change incentives, it may be, again, other barriers that are also very important, for example, for developing countries when it comes to not understanding CBAM, but to sort of how do you calculate your embedded carbon emissions and have that capacity. That will be hugely important also moving forward. So even if CBAM is expected to push this kind of pressure, it still may be hard for developing countries to actually respond to it, given other barriers.
thank you. Let's see. There we are. Just, I think you should be thinking of if you have any final questions. Or we have another 8-10 minutes to go.
So before
name.
Adrien Fabre from Paris. So before the question, just an information I got earlier today about shipping taxation, that the UK just blocked an agreement on shipping, the part of the new financial pact. The question, so it has been raised that the major issue of fairness is between countries. Where do you see the role of the EU here for climate justice, and how can Europe foster transitions in low-income countries?
Well, I'll just, while you're thinking of the response, I mean, I said something about that, and that the major injustices are between countries. I think there's been more attention to the injustices within countries. And of course, they are also sizable, but the ones between countries are gigantic.
I may start relating also to this question, if we are prepared for this global challenges. I think we would need to find clever ways to help the developing and emerging economies to see the local benefits of these new technologies and cleaner technologies. And somehow it kind of links back to this, that if these local policies, if policies should be made at the local level or at the EU level, because the local level actions, they motivate people. And if you think about the electricity sector, for example, I've been working with some global companies that are sort of kind of educating their customers, and have been involved. You can call it consulting perhaps, but you have seen it kind of at the grassroots level, what it means to try to argue to a person who is responsible for electricity distribution in Indonesia with like 250 million people, that how come this system based on renewables that is decentralized, how come it's better than the sort of old system based on fossil fuels that they have plenty around in the region. And so you know, it's a tough case, but there are certain arguments that that can be made, and you know, sometimes they relate to political cycles. For example, if you can bring the electricity to this village just before the elections, it can make sense to a local politician to go that direction. I mean, we have to be clever. We have to study the sort of micro level decisions, I think, how to promote these technologies at the grassroots level, and hope that they start spreading in the same way as they are spreading here. Then if I may comment on the taxation issue, you're right, absolutely right about this vertical and horizontal inequality, that they are two kind of separate but related concerns. So you can think about the horizontal inequality that you create by climate policy, let's say carbon tax. That is the dispersion of outcomes within an income group. So if you reduce the carbon tax in that income group, you kind of make the outcomes more compressed. You reduce the inequality of the horizontal inequality. That's one way. You can take if you take the tax altogether away, then everybody has the same in principle. Well, let me see what I'm saying. And then the one way is to sort of differentiate the taxes across the income groups, but you can also transfer wealth to them by changing the income tax they are paying. So these go together necessarily. So it's not possible to separate them out unless you have very specific assumptions. So the vertical and horizontal things, they go together. And that's why I think you cannot take out the income taxation from this. In the end, if we really go to the details, I think.
Okay, now I can respond in the usual way. I send you my paper on this. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, then let's share it. But one aspect here, I agree. I'm not saying that you can get rid of the income taxation adjustment, but what I'm saying is you need more. Yeah. You need more than that. And the question is, it's all about the information asymmetry. What kind of information the government has, and in this paper, what we show, so if you have a limitation about the horizontal inequality, so then sometimes it could be worthwhile to subsidize technologies for the poor income households in order to reduce the horizontal inequality. Yeah, so that is what I'm saying. So you cannot just and there are also households who are not paying any, at least in some countries, the income taxation. One aspect, so what on this international and what can Europe do? That's a very complicated thing. So in the European Council, what we did is we compared the fair share according to 6 principles of the European Union with the highest ambition level. And even if you have the highest ambition level for emission reduction, a significant gap remains. Even if you just say equal per capita distribution is just fair. And so this is challenged, so to say. Many people would say, no, we have to take into account historical emissions and all sorts of things. But this basically says the gap will be even larger. So what we said here is there are two ways to close the gap. The one is to a limited extent CDR. The other one is that the EU has to find a way to reduce emissions outside the EU and to find a way for cooperation. So I'm not saying this as the chair of this committee. I say this as in my capacity as a scientist. I'm a little bit concerned that we could start too much an international game on blaming and shaming. And I think so what Europe should do is and try to find a way to enhance international cooperation. I think that's important. And I think that's a way how we can find common ground, because international cooperation is required for any kind of ambition reduction goal. So in that sense, that's a complicated issue, and how to combine the just transition with efficiency again at an international scale is a quite thorny issue.
Thank you. Thanks. Now we're kind of running out of time, so Åsa will have some final comments, and then me. Or
You can
just me. Not many minutes left. So I want to thank you. It's an unusual and great privilege to have such a panel with people who are to different extents, but still having one foot in policy and one foot in theory. And so they actually sort of are thinking of their next paper, as well as thinking of how to get the European Commission to do something. And we had a lot of really important extra things come up, like carbon removal and like the international aspects. I still believe that the one piece of good news I had before, it might sound like I was pessimistic when I said just one piece of good news and many pieces of bad news, but that good news is very big and fundamental. The alternative, the renewables, are so cheap, and we can make them cheaper. There are technical problems, but they can be solved. And they can probably be solved in ways that are particularly beneficial in the poor countries. The low-income countries very typically have much more sun than Sweden. And so while the sun goes away for 6 months and we have a storage problem for 6 months, in most places, the sun goes away for 12 hours, and that's a much more trivial, well, not trivial, but solvable problem. And we have experts like you, Astrid, here on international collaboration. I think, just from reading the stuff that you and your colleagues write, it's easier to build international agreements and treaties around something that is positive, like the building of more of something that is actually getting cheaper the more you do of it. As there's more opportunities there to build reliable and sustainable coalitions than there is around the sharing of costs and historical burdens and so on that we've been focusing on. So I think there's one positive thing, that renewables really do work and do seem to get cheaper and cheaper and are really enormously plentiful. That is very fundamental, and it's something to build on. So thank you all, the audience, the online audience, and the let's give a hand of applause to the panel. Although you
meetings going on. So I'm staying here to be between here and front.